When I first decided to make a Tolkien YouTube channel, this was the video I was most excited to get to. Because, guys, in this video, I am going to begin the chief of the stories of the Silmarillion, the kernel of the mythology, the tale of Beren and Luthien. Maya Gavanen Melanin Amenek Swilayid. My name is Rainbow Dave and welcome to the first video in this playlist totally untangling one of Tolkien's most cherished tales. So the last video that I uploaded was a bit of an introduction to this story, and it was an overview of why it mattered so much both within the Legendarium and also in Tolkien's personal life. But in this video I am going to jump right into the plot. However, a great deal of what I'm going to talk about in this video is a direct continuation of what I talked about in this video, where I went through the story of the disastrous Dagor Bragolach as the Battle of Sudden Flame, in which the forces of Morgoth broke the siege of Angband and laid ruin to the north of Beleriand. So if you haven't seen that video, I recommend checking it out if you want to get like the full richness of the backstory, or at least watch the first half of it, because it's in that first half that I talk about the fall of Dorthonion and the devastation of the men of the House of Bëor who lived there. And the reason this is relevant is because Dorthonion and the House of Bëor are where I'm going to begin this series. So, the House of Bëor are of course one of the three houses of the Edain, the Elf Friends, the mortal men of Beleriand, and at the time of the disastrous Dagor Bragolach, the chieftain of the House of Bëor was this guy, Bregolas. But during the battle, Bregolas was slain, and so too were the two elven lords who ruled Dorthonion, Angrod and Aegnor, the brothers of Finrod Felagund, and of course also the brothers of Galadriel. And so, as we begin this series, what remains of the House of Bëor is a truly desperate clan of people, and the leadership of this ragged house has fallen to Bregolas's younger brother, Barahir. But Barahir's home is no longer safe. Before the Dagor Bragolach, Dorthonion was a lovely highland forest where Treebeard once climbed in the winter, and it was ruled by two great Noldorine princes. But that's all over now. Dorthonion has burned, and in its place stands Tower Nufuin, the forest under Nightshade. And this corrupted forest is a particularly nasty place. Tolkien describes Tower Nufuin as a region of such dread and dark enchantment that even the orcs would not enter it unless need drove them. The trees that grew there after the burning were black and grim, and their roots were tangled, groping in the dark like claws. And those who strayed among them became lost and blind, and were strangled or pursued to madness by phantoms of terror. In fact, Tower Nufuin also took another name at this time, Delduath, which literally means the deadly nightshade. So clearly this is a terrible place for everyone, and the survivors from the House of Bëor are hunted to the death by Morgoth's servants until few remained. But not all were killed, and this is where I want to introduce three very important mothers of the House of Bëor, all of whom are going to go on to massively shape the future of the First Age. And the first woman that I'll talk about is a lady called Rian. So Rian is the daughter of Barahir's nephew, and the reason she matters so much is that Rian will go on to become the grandmother of Eärendil, who is probably the most important figure of the First Age that I've not yet introduced. I'll get to him. But if you're familiar with the family trees, then you'll know that this makes Rian the great-grandmother of Elrond, and thus the great-great-grandmother of Arwen. Also, through the line of her other great-grandson, Elros, that's Elrond's twin brother, she is a direct ancestor of Elendil and Isildur, and eventually even Aragorn. So, although Rian doesn't do a huge amount in the story, she is an incredibly important figure in like the grand scheme of things, and I'll come back to her in future playlists. But the second woman of the House of Bëor to talk about right now is Rian's cousin, a lady called Morwen. And Morwen is also a character that I'll talk a lot more about in the future, because among her numerous claims to fame is the fact that she will go on to marry the well-known character Húrinn. She will be the mother of the famous children of Húrinn, which is a story I'll get to once we've wrapped up with Beren and Luthien. But it is worth considering that the children of Húrinn, who I reckon you've probably heard of even if you've never read the Silmarillion, are also the children of Morwen. And her story begins right here with the exodus of the House of Bëor. Anyway, the third woman to mention right now is called Emeldir. And of the three, she is by far the most relevant to this story. And I guess there's two reasons why Emeldir is so great. Firstly, she is remembered as Emeldir the Man-Hearted, which may not seem like a massively complimentary epithet, but I think in this context it refers to her hardiness and her bravery. In fact, according to top Tolkien linguist and a leading figure in the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship, Emeldir's name comes from the Sindarin Emel, meaning mother, and Dir, meaning man. So Emeldir really is a coming together of the masculine and the feminine. Anyway, the reason that Emeldir earns her epithet of the Man-Hearted is because she is the one who leads all the women and children that were left, including Morwen and Rian, away from the haunted forest under Nightshade and along perilous paths until they eventually came to the relative safety of the forest of Brethil, where the House of Bëor seeks sanctuary among the Haladin, that's the woodsmen of the House of Haleth. And in time, some of these people of the House of Bëor, they pass over the mountains into Dorthonion, and there they settle with the House of Hador under the protection of the Noldoreen High King Fingon. And what's cool about this is that we're explicitly told that Emeldir did not want to do this thing. She would much rather have stayed in Tower Nufuin to fight alongside the men against the encroaching evil that was invading her home. But she put her pride aside, and due to her leadership, the House of Bëor does survive. Perhaps we can speculate that if not for Emeldir, Morwen and Rian might have been slain, and thus there would have been no children of Húrinn, there would have been no Eärendil, or Elrond, or Arwen, or Isildur, or even Aragorn. Anyway, the other reason that Emeldir is such an important figure is because she is the wife of Barahir, and thus she is also the mother of Beren. You see, although Emeldir led most of the House of Bëor to safety, her husband and her son were not among them. We're told that a few warriors remained in their old home to resist the servants of the enemy, but these were slain one by one until at last only 12 men remained to Barahir. And these 12 men who remained with Barahir in Tower Nufuin became the Outlaws under Nightshade. They were hunted like wild beasts, their bed was the heather and their roof the cloudy sky. And Tolkien tells us that not one of these outlaws would ever be seen again by any of the House of Bëor. But Barahir was a decidedly competent leader, and for 5 years his band of outlaws evaded the servants of Morgoth, and they harried all the evil things that had taken up residence in the ruins of their old home. In some ways, they're not that dissimilar from, like, Robin Hood. And so, let's briefly take a look at the 12 merry men who made up Barahir's band of outlaws. First up, of course, we have Barahir's 28-year-old son, Beren. And realistically, Beren is infinitely more important than any of the other 11, and he's kind of the main character of like this whole series of videos. So I actually won't go into detail on him right now. There's a lot to say, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. However, Barahir does have 2 other family members among his band of outlaws, and these are his nephews Baragund and Belegund. They are the sons of Barahir's brother, Bregolas. Which means, of course, that if the Dagor Bragollach hadn't ever taken place, it would have been either Baragund or Belegund who would have taken their father's place as the chieftain of the House of Bëor. But of course that didn't happen, and so instead of being chieftains, they went on to be outlaws. Anyway, the other 9 in Barahir's gang are called Rathruin, Diaruin, Dagnir, Ragnar, Arithad, Urthil, Gillador, Gorlim, and Hathaldir the Young. Now, honestly, there's not really that much to say about these guys, except that in my mind, Rathruin is an incredibly cool sounding name. Like, he doesn't do anything at all to distinguish himself, but I just think Rathruin evokes such a badass character. I kind of wish Tolkien had reused the name at other points in the Legendarium. Like, I don't know, maybe one of Aragorn's ranger friends could have been called Rathruin, or maybe one of Faramir's warriors or something. Anyway, before I move on with the story, I do want to take a brief moment to remind you all of why Barahir is such an important figure, and why his name might sound familiar even if you've never heard the story of Beren and Luthien. So, if you recall from this video, Barahir fought in the Dagor Bragolach, but he was nowhere near his brother Bregolas when Bregolas was slain. Instead, Barahir was here, at the Fen of Serech, and it was at the Fen of Serech that Barahir fought alongside the wonderful elven lord Finrod Felagund. But if you recall from that Dagor Bragolach video, Finrod Felagund came very close to dying in that battle. He was cut off from the majority of his forces, and the only reason his life was spared is due to the bravery of Barahir and his men, who made a wall of spears around the Elven Lord and risked their own lives to give Finrod a chance to escape. And in gratitude for this act of heroism, Finrod Felagund gave to Barahir a ring that will be remembered for thousands and thousands and thousands of years as the Ring of Barahir. And this ring has a super long history throughout the entire Legendarium. Long after the First Age ends, the ring finds its way to the island of Númenor, and then it eventually becomes a symbol of the Dunedain kings of Arinor in the Third Age. Over the centuries, it passes from father to son until it eventually comes onto the finger of Aragorn, before he gives it as a wedding gift to his lover, Arwen. So remember this ring. It's important in the big picture, and it's also going to be very important in the story of Beren and Luthien as we move forward. And of course, this ring is more than just a shiny gift from Finrod Felagund. It is the token of an oath of abiding friendship between Finrod and Barahir. And because Finrod is immortal and Barahir is not, this abiding friendship will continue through the generations to all of Barahir's kin, for as long as Felagund lives. So this oath of Finrod to Barahir is vitally important in what's going to come. But anyway, back to the plot. Barahir and his outlaws, they set up a base around a lake called Eithel, which in happier days was the same lake where Finrod's brother, Eithel, first beheld the reflection of the mortal woman Andreth, and there he fell in love with her, which I talk about in this video. In fact, way back, it is said that the waters of Eithel were hallowed by Melian the Maya herself. That's the angelic wife of Eleuthingol and the queen of Doriath. However, that was long ago, and now Eithel is pathless and untamed. And although Morgoth was unable to discover the location of Barahir's outlaw band, news of their deeds did indeed reach him, and so he gave the command that Barahir and all his men must be destroyed. Which brings us to a servant of the Dark Lords who is known by the Sindarin-speaking elves as Gorthaur the Cruel. And Gorthaur is a sorcerer and a master of phantoms and a lord of deceit. And it is Gorthaur who perceives the weak link in Barahir's chain. So, of those 9 outlaws that I listed and then didn't say anything about, there is one who plays a much more important role than the rest, although it's not a positive role. You see, this guy is Gorlim, although he is remembered as Gorlim the Unhappy, which is probably saying something considering how miserable all the outlaws must have been. Anyway, the reason that Gorlim was so unhappy is that before the Dagor Bragolach, Gorlim was greatly in love, and he had a wife called Elinel. However, after returning from the war, Gorlim found that his home had been plundered and forsaken, and there was no sign of Elinel anywhere to be found. She simply disappeared. And so Gorlim joined Barahir's outlaws, but as the years passed, doubt gnawed his heart. He wondered if perhaps Eithel wasn't dead at all, but had instead been taken as a slave by the enemy. So Gorlim returned in secret to the wreckage of his homestead to search for any trace of his wife. But as he did so, he became noticed by the hunters of Gorthour. So one evening in autumn, Gorlim came back to his homestead, but this time he saw a light in the window. And as he moved closer, he saw Eithel standing there with grief and hunger on her face, but very much alive. And Gorlim heard her voice. He heard her crying, but then the light was blown out, and her voice was replaced with the howling of wolves. And Gorlim was captured by Gorthour's hunters. So they took him back to their camp and they tortured him and tormented him in the hopes that he would give up the location of Barahir's band, but he didn't. So the hunters brought Gorlim into the dreadful presence of Gorthour. Gorlim was promised that he would be released and restored to Eithel if only he'd reveal where Barahir's outlaws were hiding. Now, I think it's very easy for us to judge Gorlim for what he does next, but I would argue that this is unfair. Gorlim did what he did out of love, and at the end of the day, he was deceived. For although Gorthour is the name used by the elves of the First Age for this deceitful sorcerer, he is much better known throughout the annals of Arda as Sauron. It is Sauron who tortures Gorlim and extracts this information about Barahir. It is Sauron who conjured the illusion of Eithel in the first place. So I really do think that blaming Gorlim is basically blaming the victim. Anyway, Gorlim does eventually reveal the location of the Lake Ailuin, but only on the condition that Sauron will then reunite him with his wife. But the bitter truth is, Eithel been dead for a long time. When the betrayal is done, Sauron mocks Gorlim and reveals that all he saw in his homestead was a phantom devised by wizardry to entrap him. And then Sauron keeps his word, and he reunites Gorlim with Eithel by killing him cruelly. And so, the hiding place of Barahir and his outlaws is finally revealed to the servants of Morgoth. And this is where things go from bad to worse. But you may have noticed that so far in this video, all about how Beren met Luthien, I've not actually mentioned Luthien at all, and I've hardly mentioned Beren. So, let me remedy that. Because whilst all this Gorlim business is happening, Beren had been sent by his father on a perilous errand to spy upon the ways of the enemy. And so, Beren was alone. And as he slept on the forest floor, he had an incredibly spooky dream. He saw carrion birds sat thick as leaves upon bare trees, and blood dripped from their beaks. And then Beren saw the shape of a man come to him across the water. And we're told by Tolkien that this man was actually the undead wraith of Gorlim, which I find fascinating because although wraiths obviously do appear elsewhere in the Legendarium, they're not quite like this. I guess the ringwraiths are the most obvious example, but they're not really dead in the same way that Gorlim is dead. They're not ghosts, they are men whose souls, their Fëa, are bound to the One Ring, and so they're unable to depart Arda. It's the same with the dead men of Dunharrow. Their Fëa are bound to an oath, and they can't be released until that oath is fulfilled, but this does not seem to be the case with Gorlim. Gorlim's soul isn't bound to anything, as far as we're aware. He just seems to appear as a ghost with a warning. It feels very Hamlet. The only other instance of a ghost in Middle-earth that I've been able to find is in the Lord of the Rings appendices, where we're told that men said that the Wraith of Helm Hammerhand would walk among the foes of Rohan and kill men with fear. But this is clearly a legend, and I don't really believe it's literally true within the lore of Middle-earth. So, in my mind, Gorlim is relatively unique. Although, I guess all of this is just happening in Beren's dream, so perhaps the warning is just a message from the Valar. Anyway, what Gorlim's wraith says to Beren is the truth. He declares his treachery and his death, and he begs Beren to make haste to warn his father. So Beren immediately wakes and he speeds through the night towards Eithel and the lair of the Outlaws, but he doesn't get there until the second morning. And by the time he does arrive, all he finds are carrion birds with blood dripping from their beaks. Every one of the Outlaws is slain. Baragund and Beleriand are dead. Hathaldir the Young is dead. Rathruin is dead. And of course, Beren's father, Barahir, is also murdered. Beren is now the last mortal left in the land that used to be Dorthonion. So, the first thing Beren does upon discovering the massacre of his friends and family is to bury his father's bones and raise a cairn of boulders over them. And then he swears an oath of vengeance. And it doesn't take Beren long to fulfill this oath. We're told that he is a master of woodcraft, and this makes him an expert tracker and hunter. And Beren pursues the orcs until he comes upon their camp, which is here, interestingly, not that far at all from the fen of Serech, where Barahir first acquired the Ring of Barahir. Anyway, Beren uses his stealth to get real close to the orc's campfire, and there he hears the orc captain boasting about his brutal deeds, and he holds up the severed hand that he had cut from Barahir's wrist. And the reason Beren is able to recognize his father's hand is because it is still wearing the Ring of Barahir. I guess the orcs maybe wanted the ring as a token to show Sauron and to prove to him that they'd killed the right outlaw, but in the big picture, bragging about this ring is perhaps the worst thing these orcs could possibly have done, because it seems to push Beren's berserk button. He springs from behind a rock and he kills the orc captain in an instant. Then he takes his father's hand and the ring and he escapes into the forest. And there's a very interesting line here where Tolkien tells us that in this moment, Beren was defended by fate, for the orcs were dismayed and their arrows wild. And I've talked quite a lot about this theme of fate and a capital P plan in previous videos, but this is another excellent example of what can really only be called divine intervention. Beren is just a mortal man. He is the lord of nothing. In this moment, he is nobody, but he has Ilúvatar on his side. Beren's got a destiny, and Ilúvatar's got an eye on him. And we'll see an even more explicit example of this in just a little bit. But after this, Beren spends the next 4 years wandering Tower Nufuin completely on his own. He is a solitary outlaw, defying Morgoth and enduring the forest's dark enchantments and phantoms of terror without anyone else on his side. Well, actually, that's not 100% true, because we're told that Beren did have a few friends in the forms of birds and beasts. Tolkien writes that the animals of the wood aided him and did not betray him. And from that time forth, he ate no flesh nor slew any living thing that was not in the service of Morgoth. Which makes Beren the only confirmed vegetarian in the entire Legendarium. I know there's a stereotype that elves don't eat meat, and this is massively exacerbated by the Hobbit movies, but in the Hobbit book, we're explicitly told that the Wood Elves of Mirkwood are cooking roast meats. They're definitely not all vegetarians. Hunting is a big thing in elven culture, and even Finrod Felagund, the loveliest elf ever, was out hunting when he first encountered men. There is a valor of hunting, and it seems incredibly unlikely to me that in Valinor they would be hunting for sport. So I think it's fair to say that most elves do eat meat, but Beren doesn't, which I think is very cool. Anyway, word of Beren's solitary deeds in Dorthonion eventually travelled far and wide. In fact, Tolkien tells us that when Morgoth heard what Beren had been up to, he set a price on Beren's head that was no less than the price upon the head of Fingon. As in High King of the Noldor, Fingon, firstborn son of Fingolfin, the supreme commander of all of Morgoth's enemies, and yet he is no more wanted than the mortal Beren. That's how much of a thorn Beren is in Morgoth's side. So eventually, Morgoth decided that enough is enough, and he sent his faithful servant Sauron, along with an army of werewolves and fell beasts, into Tower Nufuin to get rid of Beren once and for all. An entire army with a Maiar in charge of it just to bring down one guy. And so, that land was now become filled with evil, and Beren had no choice but to flee for his life. So, in a time of winter and snow, Beren headed south towards the Ered Gorgoroth. That's the Mountains of Terror. And these mountains truly deserve their name. The southern wall of the mountains is a sheer precipice, and it is said that in all the ages of Beleriand, no man, elf, or orc ever passed through these mountains and survived. Except, of course, for Beren. And the reason that these mountains are so terrifying takes us back to one of my earliest videos where I talked about Ungoliant, the horrifying being who dwelt in a spider's form. After her run-in with Morgoth and her battle with his Balrogs, Ungoliant fled over the Ered Gorgoroth, and we're told she defiled this land with her offspring, and monsters wandered there that were born in the long dark before the sun. All waters were poisoned, all light was ensnared by dark webs, and many monstrous beings in spider shape took up residence there. In fact, I think we can quite safely speculate that at this time in the First Age, the Ered Gorgoroth were home to Ungoliant's most famous daughter, Shelob. Perhaps Beren and Shelob even met each other at this time. But the truth is, we have no idea, because Tolkien tells us that Beren spoke of this journey to no one after, lest the horror return to his mind. And I don't want to go over-analysing the story here, but you probably don't need me to tell you that Tolkien really did know a thing or two about trauma. He was probably very familiar with that instinct to repress mental horrors and to never speak of them. After all, Tolkien only had one close school friend who didn't die in World War I. Anyway, back to Beren. We are told that no food for elves or men was there in that haunted land, but death only. And yet, Beren survived. When he climbed to the highest regions of the Ered Gorgoroth, he looked south and he saw a faraway land that he'd never seen before. Doriath, the protected realm of Thingol and Melian. And once again, Tolkien states that the thought was put into his heart that he would go down into the Hidden Kingdom. This wasn't something that he freely decided, this is fate. Beren has to go to Doriath, and Ilúvatar is going to make that happen. But as you can see from the map, between the Ered Gorgoroth and Doriath lies this valley, Nan Dun Gortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death, one of the scariest places in all of Beleriand. And so Beren was forced to wander alone on paths that no man nor elf else ever dared to tread, until eventually he came within the borders of Doriath. But if you've seen this video, then you'll probably remember that mortals can't enter Doriath. Melian the Maya, the queen of Doriath, laid a girdle, an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment, I guess a sort of magical boundary, around the kingdom that would prevent anyone from entering the guarded realm without the king or queen's permission. Those who passed the girdle become bewildered and were enmeshed in the mazes of the queen and wandered lost amid the pathless trees until all their food was spent. But if you were paying close attention in that video, then you'll recall that when Melian first cast her girdle, she had a premonition that one day someone would come to Doriath with a power greater than her own, and he would pass through the girdle without it affecting him. In fact, in a later chapter, Melian even says to her star pupil Galadriel that one of men shall indeed come, and the girdle of Melian shall not restrain him, for doom greater than my power shall send him, and the songs that shall spring from that coming shall endure when all Middle-earth is changed. And obviously all those prophecies from centuries ago have been building to this moment. Beren himself is a mortal with no power over Melian, but his destiny, his doom, is dictated by Ilúvatar, and he has to enter Doriath, because by doing so he is beginning a chain of events that will change Middle-earth forever. Because as Beren stumbles through the woods, bowed as with many years of woe, after his unbelievably traumatic journey and the torment of the road, he wandered wild and wary as a beast under the silver moon, and there he first laid eyes on Luthien. And so, in the next video I will continue the story by talking all about Lúthien Tinuviel and who she is and where she came from. And we'll also catch up with a few familiar faces, including King Eleuthingol and his wife, Melian the Maya. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. But, as always, until then, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.